make it more and more efficient, it uses less electricity. What is really surprising is that the first purchase price or the first cost to the consumer also comes down. And I think that's where, where I think the judicious use of standards, where it is a slightly stretched goal, can really introduce cost reduction, which at the end of the day, consumers, that's what they want to see. Okay? So that's just the answer. Now coming to Ambuj's question, A123, yes, it is Yatmin Chiang, who was the founder, who was the scientist behind A123. A123's failure, and it has to be looked at, has to be analyzed properly. In the battery world, I won't go into the details of the battery world, there are many horizontals. Okay? There is the innovative materials, the people who make the materials, people who design the materials, people who make cells, and people who package them. And in any industry, there are horizontals and verticals. When the industry is horizontal, and if you try to be vertical, you have some problems that you've got to encounter. So just because someone has innovated doesn't mean that it's going to become a success, because you've got to have the right business strategy, not just the market. You've got to have the right business strategy to exploit the market. So I think one has to look at A123's failure to see what went wrong and whether there was some technological gaps as well, or whether it was a strategy, whether it was the market. And I think that the jury is still out on that. The 24M one is, yes, it is a wonderful technology. We hope it is successful. We don't know. It depends on the team's business strategy and what the market is like. And the markets need to be created, because at some point someone will come up with a good business strategy to monetize it properly. And that is what we, the government, I'm talking about we, the government, is to really create that playing field, a level playing field for the markets to be created, and let people figure out business models. And in any transition of technology, going back in history in the early 1900s, late 1800s or so, there were many technologies that failed and many technologies that succeeded. Look at the history of Standard Oil. Okay, there are a lot of things that gobbled up, and that happens. And some will fail, some will succeed.
Before we come this side, I'm going to abuse the position of the chair by posing a slightly less technical but a more political question to both Mr. Prabhu and to you, Dr. Majumdar. In your paper with Secretary Chu that you started off with, you have a telling observation where you suggest that in the last year, about 99% of the oil that was consumed globally crossed national borders. Effectively, that means oil has always been an energy security issue, but that number just puts the stamp on it. The question I have for you is, when you were describing the origins of ARPA-E and the sort of scare that came from Sputnik's launch, what were the sort of driving forces that the 2006 report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, mentioned? Was it really about, as you mentioned in your talk, if we don't innovate, someone else will? Or was it that this is really an energy security issue, not just a technology issue? The question I have, similar question I have for you, Mr. Prabhu, if we were to do something like this in India, what would be the driver? Would it be, let's try and get onto the technological bandwagon and see which would be the niche areas that we could focus on? Or is there a different, bigger political message that needs to come to get a number of different government agencies to see the potential and the reason behind doing something like this?
So, I mean, I look at it this way. When we say that innovation in energy technology will take 20 years to really make an impact, you have to think about what's the world we're going to leave our children and grandchildren. Okay? And the issue is, how can we provide security of their future? And there are three securities in that. One is national security that you were addressing. The other is economic security. That means, can we create economic growth so that people get jobs and have a better quality of life than their parents did? And the third one is environmental security. So these are the three securities, and that will ensure our kids, children and grandchildren's security. At the foundation of these all are innovations in energy technology. So innovations are absolutely key for both economic growth, national security, or environmental security. Now, sometimes, as we are seeing now in the United States, our oil imports are actually going down. Okay, that's partly A, because our economy is not picking up as fast, but also we are producing more oil domestically, and we're likely to produce more. So we may say that national security problem is not as much. Well, it's still there. We still import 45% of our oil. That's a big deal in terms of not only national security, but also our balance of trade. So it's an economic one as well. And of course, the environmental one. So many of these cases have these three-pronged security challenges that we have to address. Some of them have two, which is fine. Some of them have one, but you still, the innovation and energy technology. So now the question is, okay, well, with the science and engineering infrastructure that we have in the United States, do we have the capacity to innovate? And the answer is, yeah, I think we can. If you have the right investment, if they have the right strategy, yes, we can. So then the question is, well, if you don't invest in that, someone else will, and we may not get the economic benefit of that, someone else might. So it's a competitiveness issue, but it's a cooperative issue as well. So I think that's the approach that we are taking.
No, I think it will be quite a few factors. Of course, all of that will influence India's decision making on that. But look at some of the localized issues. One is Naxalite problem in India, which we have always overlooked. And that problem is now almost in 1/3 of the country, 200 districts. So essentially, if you want to really bring about economic development in that part, that's the only way we can address it on a long-term basis. We'll have to give electricity, and that is impossible, inconceivable that that part of the country where this problem is so rampant will be able to actually give grid-connected electricity. So we'll have to think about different ideas about how to take electricity there, because without that economic development will not take place, and without that social issues like Naxalite issues can never be addressed. So that will be one trigger that will come from the social perspective. The second one is the same, as you mentioned, the macroeconomic issue. In fact, today, one of the reasons why the monetary policy has failed to arrest inflation, despite increasing interest rates, is also the pressure on the currency itself. The rupee is depreciating so fast, and the result, the real intrinsic reason for that is something that our trade deficit is so high, and that trade deficit finally gets into the current account deficit, and current account deficit being now close to 3% of GDP, it is inconceivable that rupee will be stabilized. So that again will be pushing us, because if you don't control the fall of rupee, it will have so much of adverse impact on so many other sectors, including inflation. So India cannot afford to have the inflation at this level. So that would also mean that we'll have to reduce the trade deficit by diversifying our energy basket. And I think the third one, which will essentially be coming from, actually now it is all people are watching televisions and everything else. So they really want to have the type of electricity that people want. In fact, in Mumbai, where it's really an island, but Mumbai people think that it is their birthright to have 24/7 power, because they forget that just cross Mumbai's border, just about 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers from Mumbai, they don't get 24/7 power. But now they want it because they have used it. And because Mumbai is using it, the next door neighbor also wants it. So I think after some time, everybody is going to demand that electricity. And it is impossible that we can actually cater to that demand by importing oil or by gas or by doing something else. So this will actually be essentially coming from some domestic solution. What is the local resource available? I think there, unfortunately, we are missing a very important opportunity. Like if we collaborate on some of this research, need not be fundamental and basic research. Like if you can improve the efficiency of PV to some 28-29%, which is in the realm of reality in the next few years' time, will be the biggest beneficiary because we have the highest sunlight. Now there, we could use some of this opportunity. I was just talking to Minister Farooq Abdullah only in the noon time actually. I think that was the right time to discuss that issue, because noon time is the time when the radiation is highest. So I was telling Dr. Abdullah, why not we create a solar energy club of those countries who have more than 300 days of sunshine, and therefore the radiation is high. And therefore if we make a club like the OPEC and try to generate solar energy, we'll be benefiting from the technological innovation that you are doing it, because we are the market, because we are the sun. You cannot produce solar energy without sun. We have it. So I think that could be another trigger in terms of making available the technological innovations, inventions and innovation taking place outside. How can we integrate them into the country? But I think we are in a way advantageous position now, because in India we normally only react to a crisis. So I think when crisis comes, we should be very happy that now crisis is coming. So I think some solutions will happen.
You've been waiting for a long time, sir. Why don't you put your question across, then Padu, I'll come to you, then I'll come to you, Dr. Kapoor, and I'll come.
My question connects to all three.
Could you also introduce yourself?
My name is Ravi Kaimal. I'm an architect by training, but involved in various things, including a CII Water Institute. What I have seen, especially in India, is that the genuine user, somebody who owns, let's say, a building or a property and uses it, invest in these technologies to make themselves independent of the grid and not be crippled by a grid outage or a water shortage. This is already happening even with the low efficiency existing technologies. But at the commercial developer end, A, they don't believe in global warming. B, they don't care because the tenant pays the energy bills and the water bills. So we find consistently that they don't even accept the idea of putting in cheap insulation into the buildings. That's at the top end. So it all connects up to finance, and this is illustrated very graphically at the bottom end by an NGO which has been working in rural areas in the private sector, who discovered that the key is to be able to supply the energy at a reasonable cost, and that translated into renting the battery for the evening when the light was on, as opposed to investing in the systems and all the rest of it. So the essence of it is that the finance has to push, and till that happens, till the banks tell the big developers, till some local guy finances the battery or whatever, it's not going to happen. But the need is there, the pull is there, it is getting stuck for a few rupees at the bottom end and millions of rupees at the top end. So.
Padu, you had a question.
Padmanabhan from USAID. Arun, excellent presentation. Coming back to ARPA-E, Arun, one way of looking at ARPA-E was that you have within the government system developed a process to accelerate the pace of market-driven R&D in a short period of time. So what would normally have taken 10, 15, 20 years, if at all, you are able to collapse it within a time frame of maybe 1, 2, or 3 years. I guess when you do that, you're up against an issue. Do you back bleeding edge technologies or cutting edge technologies, or does it matter at all? Because if it's bleeding edge technologies, then there's a huge cost involved. It's not going to get commercialized that easily. And of course, cutting edge technologies means the risks are much less. So did you come across that issue, or is it an issue at all?
Well, it's actually, it could be an issue unless you define what ARPA-E's goal is before others defined it for us. And we made a specific point that we will look for white space, as I mentioned, which is a gap in technology. And as I described, that will create entirely new learning curves. We will not do incremental work down a current learning curve, even though it's the bleeding edge. We were very clear, because not only would it be the identity crisis for ARPA-E, it will actually infringe upon what the rest of the DOE is doing. And there's an internal issue then. And so we had to partner. So I mean, this is when DARPA was formed in 1958, all the other service labs were trying to kill DARPA. And we were quite aware of that, when ARPA-E was formed. So we had to make sure that ARPA-E's role was very unique and specific, and so that other parts of the Department of Energy actually benefited from what we did. And so that was, bleeding edge and cutting edge, whichever way you define it, it was the idea that we will not go down a current learning curve, we will create entirely new learning curves. And that's what we stuck to that.
Let's take 2 more questions. Dr. Kapoor, you had a question there.
I chair CII's task force on solar. You very elegantly spelled out, the linkage between energy and economic growth through all your very fantastic exponential curves. The challenge in India is, and I think Mr. Prabhu talked about it, is rural India, where 70% of India lives, and it's quite clear that we're not going to be able to take the grid over there. Yet, electricity, from our Electricity Act, it's a universal service obligation, so we have to be able to supply power in rural India at the same kinds of prices as which we supply the rest of the country. Not at the kind of lighting prices you're talking about, where you're giving 4 watts of electricity, it's costing 15 rupees, but the poor guy is paying 5 rupees. So he compares it to the cost of kerosene and he finds it acceptable, but not enough for economic activity. arising out of the kinds of things you are doing. When I'm talking now about those parts of the country, rural India, where grid will not reach,
Yes.
right? What kind of solutions do you see, or what kind of collaboration do you see that we can, do what we did with mobile telephones to landlines,
Right.
and the big grid to rural India?
Well, that's part of the reason, you know, we had a discussion earlier this morning with Dr. Ghosh and Mr. Prabhu, and sort of provoked me to put this particular slide in this talk of this. That is, this grid that you're talking about on the left-hand side is not going to reach, or let's put it this, not, I hate to use these firm terms, unlikely to reach many of the remote areas who are far away from the grid, which has provoked our work in Google right now to look for, see, everyone who works on the grid takes today's architecture and tries to improve it. Whereas the approach we're taking is that let's forget today's architecture, because if solar were available during Tesla's time, the grid would look very different. And it might look something like that, that you have multiple generators. So you want to lay out a wire, almost like an extension cord, okay, still be very efficient, and you can put multiple solar panels, multiple loads on it, and it has to balance in real time. And that's not trivial, okay? And that technology, the operating system for a grid, because an individual like me or anyone else cannot, turn on generators and in a fraction of a second. You see, the grid today that we have, you can turn on a switch and turn off a switch without changing the rest of the grid, because the grid has inertia. Okay, there are rotating machinery on it, which has enough inertia that it's not going to collapse. Imagine if you had a solar panel and LED lighting somewhere else in the grid. It has no inertia. And if you turn off something and turn on something, it changes the grid. And the grid has to balance itself in an automated way, because I cannot respond that quick. No one else can. No one can. That operating system, the technology for that, does not exist today in a distributed way. And that is where we are focusing on right now. And we're trying to get the best minds to work on this, because it's a nonlinear problem. Power and voltage are nonlinear relationships. So trying to maintain a voltage or a frequency or a VAR at a certain location and doing it in a balanced way, as I said, is a technology that we need to develop for distributed new architectures, which is something like this. And that's what we're trying to do right now.
This is one part of the problem. The other part is the technological solution to be able to provide, to generate power, like what we're talking about, in a distributed manner, which is cost effective, and compares with the cost of grid power today.
Right.
So do you see opportunities like
Absolutely.
what
I mean, the solar today, if you look at the grid out here in India, it's what, 10 rupees, 7 rupees, 6 rupees a kilowatt hour. Okay. Now you will get to that level by solar, I would say pretty soon. If there's, in the next, within this decade, we should be able to get to that level, by using solar. And some of the cheap solar panels from China, the efficiency actually is going to go up in the future. So that's the opportunity that we have. And not only that, backed up by, there are diesel gensets that can still be used. They're more expensive, but when the sunlight is not, that balancing act has to be done. But I think solar will be cheap.
I'm afraid we have time for only one last question. I'm going in order of those who put up their hands. So, sir, on the front row.
Arun, my question is based on your last slide that you put up, which is innovation has to be supported by policy and markets and demand. What is happening today is U.S. has lots of innovations going on, but the manufacturing is happening somewhere else, from First Solar to any companies. How can we try and see that we have this full cycle, end-to-end life cycle value chain that can be created in U.S. and maybe U.S. and India tries to do something? Because what I see from our side is China taking over in this. They may not have, currently they may not have a lot of innovation going on, but a lot of the manufacturing and maybe even the markets are happening there.
You see, if I'm a businessman, I want to get my cost down as much as possible. And if China is providing a service where they already have an ecosystem of a certain amount of manufacturing, I will go to China and get it manufactured, which is what is happening. And I think it is, I would say, it is too much to expect all of manufacturing being in one country. That is unlikely to happen. I think what you'll see is global supply chains. And when you have global supply chains, what the United States should do is, in that global supply chain, where's the biggest value that R&D can contribute that others cannot? Where the biggest margins are the biggest values, and see whether we can keep those parts of the manufacturing, not the nuts and screws, which have low margins, you need lots of it, but the high-end part of it, whether we can keep that. And that requires some strategy in investments and creating the markets. So if I were to create windmills in the United States, let's say, I have to create the demand for it, okay? Because they're so big that it's unlikely to be shipped from China. So if I create the market for it, most likely the manufacturing will happen out there, okay, in the United States. So that's a demand creating thing that will create the manufacturing out there. Some things are lighter, okay, they may be manufactured somewhere else, but then there are other policies that one can introduce. So manufacturing is an interesting, I mean, there are lots of angles to it. You need the skill sets. And there are jobs, manufacturing jobs in the United States right now, but they're not getting filled because the skills are not there. So there's a human capital side to it. There's a finance side to it. The capital needs to be available at low cost. So it's a multivariable problem, which I'm not sure at least I'm wearing my US hat. I don't know what's going on as much as in India. But in the US, we have not, I would say, done a good enough job in coming up with a strategy to promote manufacturing. We need to do much more. We have done some things, but not enough, I think.
And I think that's where we are working on, and we'd like to probably share some thoughts, because if we do not do this, I think this century is going to become a China-dominant society.
Mr. Prabhu, a final comment from you?
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So Dr. Majumdar, thanks a lot, and all of you for participating in this debate and a dialogue to find out how we can really move on. I think for India, we really have a great opportunity here, because even 44% of the households do not have electricity, and even at least 30% of the remaining do not have assured electricity. So in fact, we really need to find a solution, and it could be a time when such new ideas can actually be incorporated, particularly in the distributed generation. And you mentioned about Electricity Act 2003. So we seldom talk about that act in terms of generation, but there is also a huge space devoted to talk about distributed generation. So I think there is a legislative framework already available to make it happen. Now, to bring in innovation and invention, we really need signals. One signal can come from market, but the other signal, and a very strong one, can come from policy. So I think before we develop a market, I think if we can start with policy as an initiation, and we really make a policy in India, keeping in mind not just the type of policy that we made last time, what are the local resources available, based on that how can we create an energy future for the country. And there I think renewables will stand out, obviously, because that's the only resource which is available in abundance. Solar is there, also wind. We have got now 650,000 megawatts of possible potential in solar, in wind. Also probably we are not even included offshore wind. So if you include that, could it again be higher? So if you can actually make starting point of a policy which begins with this and build up an architecture on that, and actually the policy follows, I'm sure the innovation will also come in. But I will really look forward to this. And in fact, if you really look at it, if all the invention take place in US, and also the manufacturing take place in US, probably nobody's going to buy those products, because the market will be outside of the US, particularly in India. So probably it's a time to have invention there probably, but also to have a that collaboration in which probably the manufacturing can take place in India for catering to the domestic market. So I think that could be a very good point that we can work on. So thank you very much for joining in, and I think I will give it to Arnaba to make some closing thoughts. Thank you.
I don't have to make any closing thoughts. Thanks to both Dr. Majumdar and Mr. Prabhu. And thanks to the Aspen team and the CEEW team for putting this together. It's been a great week for us. Last Thursday, we had the British Chief Scientific Advisor speaking on food, energy, and water security. Then we had Amory Lovins from the Rocky Mountain Institute. And today, Dr. Majumdar. So it's a great week to cap it all. And I'm sure you have more burning questions, which we can take over tea. Thank you.